porch light clicked off at 11:42 p.m., the way it did every night, and across the street under a street lamp that buzzed faintly in the humidity, David Whitfield noticed the boat again. It sat in Rick's driveway wrapped in a blue tarp, rain beating on the plastic like it was waiting for permission to be seen. Rick had paid cash. He'd mentioned it twice at the mailbox already. In that particular way, people mention things when they actually want you to ask about them. David hadn't asked. He just nodded, said something about the weather, and walked back inside to a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the pasta Sarah had made 3 hours earlier. He was 41, a mechanical engineer at a parts supplier outside Dayton, Ohio. Married to Sarah, who taught 3rd grade and still color-coded the grocery list. 2 kids upstairs who believed, without complication, that tomorrow would look roughly like today. A Honda Pilot in the driveway with 94,000 miles on it, making a small clicking sound on cold mornings he'd been ignoring since October. Nothing was wrong. That was the strange part. Nothing was wrong. And yet standing there with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, David felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not envy, exactly. Not failure. Something closer to the feeling of running on a treadmill that had quietly, imperceptibly tilted uphill. He opened his laptop at the kitchen table because the house was the only place quiet enough to admit it. I need more income. That was the sentence he typed first, the honest one, the one that had been circling for months disguised as budgeting anxiety and Sunday night dread. He expected the search to lead him toward a side hustle, a certification, maybe a return to an old idea about consulting on weekends. Instead, it led him to a name he hadn't thought about in nearly 20 years. Marcus Ferreira had been David's college roommate, the guy who wore the same 3 t-shirts on rotation and never seemed to have a plan for anything. They drifted apart the ordinary way, through nothing dramatic, just years. David found him again in a mutual friend's wedding photos, and what he saw stopped him mid-scroll. Marcus wasn't wearing anything expensive. He wasn't posing near anything shiny. He simply looked like a man who had stopped worrying about money a long time ago, in that specific, unbothered way that almost nobody actually manages. David messaged him before he could talk himself out of it. They met on a Thursday, not for coffee, but at 9 p.m. outside a 5-story office building downtown, because Marcus had said, cryptically, "Come see it instead of hearing about it." The building was dark, except for a scattering of lit windows on the 3rd floor, and when David followed Marcus inside, the lobby was empty, the elevator silent, the whole place holding the specific stillness of a building that has already finished being useful for the day. On the 3rd floor, a small crew in navy polos moved between cubicles with vacuums and spray bottles, working in a rhythm that looked almost choreographed. Marcus gestured at them like a man presenting a magic trick. "This is the business," he said. "Nobody dreams about this." And he was right. There is no glamour in a mop bucket, no story here anyone tells at a dinner party. But Marcus held 4 contracts like this one, buildings and clinics and a bank branch, and every one of them paid him automatically, every month, without a single sales call. "The money isn't in cleaning," Marcus said, wiping a thin layer of dust off a reception desk with his finger just to make the point. "It's in the contract. Nobody wants to interview 3 new vendors and retrain a new crew over a service they don't even want to think about. So, they stay. Not because we're the best, because switching feels riskier than staying." That sentence sat in David's chest the whole drive home, and he told himself it was interesting, nothing more, a curiosity. He still believed at that point that the real fix was a better investment, something smarter than his 401k, something with more upside. He didn't yet understand that he was standing at the beginning of a much longer education, one that had nothing to do with the stock market at all. The next lesson found him almost by accident. Marcus mentioned a friend named Deb who ran a pest control company 2 counties over, and David, more out of habit now than conviction, asked to ride along one Saturday morning. Deb's truck smelled like citrus spray and gasoline, and she drove with the practiced calm of someone who had done this exact route hundreds of times, turning into driveway after driveway for what she called the quarterly. Homeowners barely came outside. A few waved. One woman in a bathrobe simply opened the garage door, nodded, and went back inside, as if Deb's arrival were as unremarkable as the mail. Nobody questioned the invoice that would appear on their card in 3 days. David asked Deb at the 4th house whether anyone ever canceled. She laughed, not unkindly. "Only the ones who've never actually seen termites," she said. "Everyone else pays without opening the bill. Fear, once it's been real, doesn't need convincing twice. It just needs to never come back." David thought that was the whole lesson, until Deb added something almost offhand, backing out of a driveway. People don't buy pest control, she said. They buy the feeling of not thinking about it. That single sentence rearranged something in David's head, quietly, the way a key finally turns in a lock that's been stubborn for years. If you had to buy one business that could pay you for the next 20 years, which one would it be? David asked Marcus that week, half joking. Marcus didn't answer right away. You're asking the wrong question, he finally said, and he wouldn't explain what he meant. Not yet. The next stop wasn't a meeting at all. It was a building David had driven past nearly every day for 6 years without truly seeing it. A long corridor of orange metal doors on the edge of his own town. He pulled in on a whim one evening and found the manager locking up, a woman named Priya who'd run the place for 8 years. She let him walk the rows. Unit after unit, padlocked, silent, most of them untouched in months according to the access logs on her tablet. One renter, she mentioned, hadn't visited his unit in 4 years and had never missed a single payment. David asked why anyone would pay to store things they never looked at. Priya shrugged like she'd heard the question 100 times. Getting rid of it means admitting something, she said. Paying $10 a month is easier than that conversation with yourself. David stood in the cold hallway a long time after she left, surrounded by other people's unfinished decisions, each one quietly worth more to the owner of the building than to the person paying for it. This is where it stopped feeling like research and started feeling like something closer to an obsession. David began keeping a small notebook in his glove box, the kind of detail that made Sarah raise an eyebrow at dinner but not object. He didn't fully understand yet what he was building. He only knew the questions had changed shape. It wasn't, how do I make more money anymore? It had quietly become, why do people keep paying for the things they keep paying for? He found the next answer at 2 a.m., of all hours, standing in the loading dock of a commercial laundry facility that served 3 hotels and a regional hospital. A friend of Deb's ran it, a man named Thomas, who worked nights because that's when the trucks came in. Steam rolled off industrial dryers the size of small cars, and the noise was constant, a mechanical tide that never really stopped. Tomas explained it without ceremony. A hospital can postpone almost anything except clean sheets, he said. They can delay a renovation. They can't delay laundry. That's not a sales pitch I have to make. That's just true every single day, good economy or bad. David watched a driver load hampers into a truck bound for a hotel 40 minutes away and understood, standing in that steam and noise at 2 a.m, that some businesses aren't chosen by customers so much as they are required by circumstance. He thought for a while that this whole search might resolve into a job change, some new career adjacent to what he'd just learned, a way to work inside one of these industries instead of buying into one. That idea lasted about 3 weeks, and it collapsed the moment he tried to picture himself actually doing it. He didn't want to run a laundry facility at 2 a.m. He didn't want Deb's Saturday route or Priya's key ring heavy with padlock combinations. What he wanted, he was slowly beginning to admit, wasn't a different way to work. It was a different relationship between his time and his money altogether, one where the two weren't chained together by the hour. It fell apart in a hospital corridor, oddly enough, while David was there for his son's stitches after a bike accident that turned out to be nothing serious. Waiting in that fluorescent hallway, he watched a man in a company polo unlock a vending machine, restock rows of snacks and drinks, lock it again, and walk out inside of 4 minutes. No conversation, no transaction beyond a swipe of a card by tired parents and overnight nurses who weren't comparing prices, weren't negotiating, weren't even really looking at the machine as anything other than a small relief from a small discomfort. David realized, watching this, that convenience doesn't compete on price. It competes on the fact that nobody wants to think harder than they have to at 11 p.m. in a hospital. A person exhausted enough will pay almost anything not to have to make one more decision that night. Then, on a job site across town where his own company was installing a conveyor system, he noticed the equipment rental trailers parked along the fence line, scaffolding and generators stamped with a logo he didn't recognize. He asked the foreman about it, expecting a shrug. Instead, the foreman laughed. Nobody wants to own this stuff, he said. We'd need a warehouse, insurance, a mechanic on staff. Renting it means someone else carries all that risk, and we just carry the job. David understood, standing in the mud of that job site, that the rental company wasn't really renting equipment. It was renting away someone else's uncertainty, one job at a time, across dozens of customers whose individual chaos smoothed out into the rental company's very calm, very predictable monthly statement. The contractor faced one unpredictable deadline. The rental yard, quietly, faced none, because it had learned to profit from everybody else's emergency without ever having to feel the emergency itself. One business completely changed the way David looked at money after that, and it wasn't even a business he expected to matter. It was the car wash down the street from his office, the one he'd started using not out of loyalty but convenience after signing up for the unlimited monthly plan almost carelessly. He noticed, 3 months in, that he was washing his car nearly every week, far more than he ever had paying per visit. He mentioned this to Sarah, almost embarrassed, and she laughed and said she'd done the same thing with her yoga studio membership. Neither of them needed convincing to keep paying. The subscription had already been decided. What was left was only the quiet instinct not to waste something already committed to, an instinct neither of them had chosen so much as fallen into. That January, David's own furnace made a sound it had never made before, at 11 at night, in single-digit weather, with both kids asleep upstairs. The technician who came the next morning fixed it in 20 minutes and then, almost as an afterthought, asked if David wanted to enroll in a maintenance plan, so this never happened again. David signed without hesitation, without comparing prices, without a second thought, and only later did he recognize the shape of what had just happened to him. He hadn't bought a maintenance plan. He'd bought insurance against a memory he never wanted to have twice. The most uncomfortable discovery came from a friend of Marcus's who ran portable sanitation for construction sites and festivals across 3 states, a business David had privately assumed was a joke until he saw the contracts. Every job site is legally required to provide it. Every festival over a certain size is required to provide it. There's no negotiating your way out of a legal requirement, the man told David flatly, and there's almost no competition either, because almost nobody is willing to build a career around something this unglamorous. David sat with that for a long time afterward. It was the ugliest business on the list, and, quietly, one of the most protected, guarded less by innovation than by everyone else's unwillingness to take it seriously. By the time he reached the 11th discovery, David's thinking had shifted again, though he didn't notice it happening in real time. He'd stopped thinking he needed a better investment. He'd stopped thinking he needed a new job. He found himself, one evening, reading through the back end of a tiny piece of software a friend of a friend had built, a simple scheduling tool used by maybe 200 small dental offices around the country, each paying a modest monthly fee that barely registered on their books. The founder, a quiet guy named Alan, who'd built it alone in a spare bedroom, told David something that stuck harder than almost anything else he'd heard all year. Nobody switches scheduling software, Alan said, because retraining a receptionist is worse than tolerating something imperfect. David realized this was the same idea he'd already learned from Marcus's cleaning contracts, translated into code instead of cubicles. The interface had changed. The human resistance to change had not. The final discovery was also the one that unsettled David the most, and it came from a mobile home park an hour outside the city, one Marcus mentioned almost reluctantly, as if he'd been saving it for last on purpose. The owner didn't own most of the homes at all. He owned the land underneath them. Residents owned their trailers outright and paid month after month simply for the dirt below their own front steps. And the reason almost nobody left, the owner explained without much emotion, was that moving a mobile home is expensive, difficult, sometimes physically impossible depending on its age. David stood at the edge of that property as the sun dropped behind a line of trees and felt for the first time in this entire search something closer to discomfort than admiration. The cash flow here wasn't protected by convenience or fear or habit alone. It was protected, in part, by the sheer difficulty of leaving, by an immobility that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with circumstance. He didn't love how that felt. He wrote it down anyway because the notebook wasn't for comfort. It was for truth, and the truth wasn't always flattering. And it was there, standing in that quiet field, that the entire shape of the year finally clicked into place for him, because somewhere between the empty office building and the laundry steam and the vending machine in that hospital hallway, David realized this had never actually been 11 separate businesses. It had never been about cleaning or pest control or storage units or software or dirt under a trailer. Every single one of them, without exception, obeyed one identical structure hiding just beneath the surface. None of them required Marcus or Deb or Priya or Thomas or Alan to be brilliant. None of them required constant selling, constant pitching, constant hustling for the next customer. Each one had simply built a system that collected money on a predictable schedule from people who had a reason, financial, emotional, or logistical, not to leave. That was the entire secret, standing behind every single story he'd walked through that year. Not the industry, not the niche, the structure underneath it. David thought, for the first time with total clarity, about his own career, 20 years of proving his value every quarter. Every review cycle, every rumor of reorganization that swept the office like weather nobody could control. He had built 2 decades of income that depended entirely on him personally showing up, personally performing, one day at a time, with no system running quietly underneath it while he slept. Marcus hadn't gotten rich by being smarter than David. He'd gotten rich by attaching himself to a mechanism that kept generating cash flow whether he felt inspired that morning or not, whether he was on vacation or sick or simply tired. This was the same idea Charlie Munger spent a lifetime trying to hand to anyone willing to listen. That the rarest skill in business isn't cleverness, it's recognizing which structures let ordinary human behavior do the heavy lifting for you, indefinitely, without needing to be re-earned every single day. It was the same quiet truth Morgan Housel kept circling in his own writing, that the boring, repeatable choices tend to outlast the exciting ones, because excitement rarely survives 20 years intact, while boredom, engineered correctly, compounds like interest nobody bothers to watch. There are two versions of what happens next for a man like David, and both are entirely plausible. In one version, he closes the notebook that winter, feels briefly inspired the way people often do after brushing against something true, and changes nothing. He returns to work Monday. The feeling fades by Wednesday. 5 years pass, and he is still trading his hours for a paycheck 1 week at a time, still slightly behind, still watching some other neighbor's boat sit under some other tarp, wondering quietly why the gap between comfortable and free never seems to close, no matter how many raises arrive. In the other version, David does something smaller and far less dramatic than quitting anything. He spends the better part of 2 years learning one of these unglamorous models properly, studying contracts and retention and cash flow the way an engineer studies a system rather than the way a gambler studies odds. Eventually, he buys a small, boring regional laundry route, not because it excited him, but because the math refused to lie and the customers weren't going anywhere. It doesn't make him rich overnight. It grows the way boring things grow, quietly, collecting monthly payments from people who never think twice about paying them. A decade later, David isn't on a stage anywhere. He simply has a kind of financial certainty most people spend entire careers chasing and never quite catch, built in the background while he kept living his regular life in the meantime. Neither ending was ever meant to be dramatic, because the truth underneath this whole year was never dramatic to begin with. If you had to buy one business that could pay you for the next 20 years, the honest answer was never a specific business at all. It was never the cleaning contracts or the storage units or the vending machine in that hospital hallway. It was the structure quietly running beneath every single one of them. Recurring revenue collected on autopilot, cash flow that didn't depend on anyone's motivation that particular morning, systems engineered to keep running long after the selling had stopped. That structure is what Marcus had. It's what Deb had, and Priya, and Thomas, and Alan, and the man who owned the dirt under other people's trailers. The businesses were never the actual point. They were only proof of something underneath them. The boat in Rick's driveway was never the real story either. It never had been. It was only the first thing loud enough, on one ordinary night, to make David finally ask the quiet question he'd been avoiding for years. He didn't need a boat. He didn't need another job. He needed a system, one that would still be collecting quietly long after he'd stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. And once he finally understood the difference, he never looked at another driveway or another Tuesday the same way again. Before you leave, I want you to answer one question in the comments. Out of these 12 businesses, which one surprised you the most, and which one would you actually consider owning? I'll be reading every answer because I'm curious what pattern you noticed. And if you enjoy videos that break down wealth, business psychology, and the hidden systems behind how money actually works, not flashy motivation, but timeless ideas that compound, hit subscribe. We publish long-form research stories like this every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.